When a lonely Dakota Territory rancher discovers a young woman tied to his fence like livestock by her own father, he makes a choice that will shatter both their carefully guarded worlds. But as dark secrets from her past threaten to destroy the fragile sanctuary they've built together, will their newfound bond prove strong enough to redefine what it truly means to have worth? The old wooden fence post creaked in the morning wind like a dying man's last breath. Ezra Whitlock pulled his worn leather gloves tighter as he rode along the edge of his ranch, watching for broken boards that might let his cattle wander into trouble. The Dakota Territory stretched out before him like a brown ocean, endless and empty under the pale September sky of 1867. His horse, Belle, knew this path by heart. They had ridden it every morning for 3 years, ever since Martha died from the fever that swept through the territory like wildfire. Ezra talked to Belle sometimes, just to hear a voice that wouldn't talk back or ask questions he couldn't answer. Today felt different though. The air smelled of change, like rain coming from far away. "Easy girl," he whispered as Belle's ears twitched forward. Something had caught her attention near the eastern fence line, where his property met the open prairie. Ezra squinted against the morning sun, trying to see what had spooked his usually calm mare. At first, he thought it might be a deer caught in the wire. Then his heart stopped cold. A person sat slumped against his fence post, arms tied behind their back with thick rope. As he rode closer, Ezra could see it was a young woman, her dark hair hanging like a curtain over her face. Her blue cotton dress was torn and dirty, and she wasn't moving. Ezra jumped down from his saddle faster than he had moved in years. His boots hit the ground hard as he ran toward the fence. The woman's head lifted slowly, and he saw eyes the color of storm clouds, wide with fear and exhaustion. She looked like she hadn't slept or eaten in days. "Ma'am." Ezra's voice came out rough from surprise. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" She nodded, but no words came out. Her lips were cracked and dry. Ezra could see the rope had been tied so tight it left red marks on her wrists. Whoever had done this wanted to make sure she couldn't get away. "I'm going to cut these ropes," he said gently, pulling out his pocket knife. "Don't be afraid. I won't hurt you." As the rope fell away, she rubbed her wrists and tried to speak. "Water," she whispered, her voice like sandpaper. "Please." Ezra grabbed his water bottle from his saddle and helped her drink slowly. The water seemed to bring life back to her face, and she looked up at him with gratitude that made his chest tight. "Thank you," she said, stronger now. I thought no one would find me." "Who did this to you?" Ezra asked, though he was afraid to hear the answer. The woman's face went pale. "My father. He said I was nothing but trouble and expense. Said maybe someone out here would take me off his hands." She looked down at her torn dress with shame. "He tied me here last night and left me." Ezra felt anger rise in his throat like bile. He had seen cruel men before, but leaving your own daughter tied to a fence like an unwanted animal was evil beyond his understanding. "What's your name?" "Lydia," she said quietly. "Lydia Brennan." The name meant nothing to Ezra, but the pain in her voice told him everything he needed to know. This girl had been hurt by the one person who should have protected her most. Now she sat on his land, looking at him like he might be her salvation or her doom. "Well, Miss Brennan," Ezra said, standing up and offering her his hand. "Nobody deserves to be left tied up like livestock. Why don't you come to my cabin? You need food and rest." Lydia stared at his outstretched hand like it might be a trap. "Why would you help me? You don't know me." "Don't need to know you to know right from wrong," Ezra replied. "My mama raised me better than to leave a person in need." Slowly, carefully, Lydia took his hand and let him help her stand. Her legs shook from sitting tied up all night, and Ezra had to steady her with his arm. She felt light as a bird and just as fragile. "Can you ride?" he asked, nodding toward Belle. "I think so," Lydia said, though her voice held doubt. Ezra helped her up onto Belle's back, then climbed up behind her. As they rode toward his cabin, he wondered what he had gotten himself into. He lived alone by choice, finding peace in the quiet routines of ranch life. Taking in a stranger, especially a young woman, would change everything. But as they reached his small wooden cabin with smoke curling from the chimney, Ezra realized he didn't care about the complications. For the first time in 3 years, he felt like he had a purpose beyond just surviving each day. Whatever troubles Lydia Brennan brought with her, they couldn't be worse than the loneliness that had been eating at his soul since Martha died. Inside the warm cabin, Lydia sat stiff as a board at Ezra's kitchen table, her hands folded tight in her lap. She watched his every move like a deer ready to bolt at the first sign of danger. Ezra tried to move slowly and speak softly as he worked at his wood-burning stove, scrambling eggs and frying bacon for breakfast. The cabin felt different with another person in it. Smaller somehow, but also more alive. Sunlight streamed through the clean windows, showing off Martha's touches that Ezra had kept exactly as she left them. The blue checkered curtains, the row of ceramic jars filled with flour and sugar, the rocking chair by the fireplace where she used to sit and sew. "You have a beautiful home," Lydia said quietly, breaking the silence that had stretched between them. "My wife made it beautiful," Ezra replied, cracking another egg into the pan. "I just try to keep it the way she liked it." "Where is she now?" Lydia asked, then quickly added, "I'm sorry. I shouldn't pry." "She died 3 winters back," Ezra said, surprised at how easily the words came out. He rarely talked about Martha with anyone. Fever took her fast. One day she was laughing at my terrible jokes. The next day she was gone. Lydia's face softened with understanding. "I'm sorry for your loss. She must have been very special." "She was," Ezra agreed, setting a plate of hot food in front of her. "Now eat. You look like you haven't had a proper meal in days." Lydia picked up her fork but hesitated before taking a bite. "What do you want from me?" she asked suddenly. Nobody helps a stranger without wanting something back. The question hit Ezra like a punch to the gut. He sat down across from her and looked into those storm-gray eyes, seeing years of disappointment and betrayal there. "I don't want anything from you, Miss Brennan. I'm helping because it's the right thing to do." "Men always want something," Lydia said bitterly. "My father said I was worthless. But even worthless things can be useful if you find the right purpose for them." "Your father was wrong," Ezra said firmly. "Dead wrong. And any man who would tie his own daughter to a fence and leave her doesn't deserve to call himself a father at all." Tears filled Lydia's eyes, but she blinked them back quickly. "You don't know what I've done, what kind of trouble I bring." "Then tell me," Ezra said gently. "Or don't. Your choice. But you're safe here, and you can stay as long as you need to figure out what comes next." Lydia took a small bite of eggs, then a larger one. She was hungrier than she wanted to admit. "I ran away from home 2 weeks ago," she said between bites. "My father wanted to marry me off to his business partner, a man older than you with 3 wives already buried. When I refused, he said I was ungrateful and rebellious." "So you left," Ezra said. It wasn't a question. "I took some bread and cheese from the kitchen and walked away in the middle of the night. I thought I could make it to Yankton, maybe find work as a seamstress or a cook." Lydia's voice grew quiet. "But I got lost on the prairie. When I finally found my way back to a town, my father was waiting. He dragged me home and locked me in the root cellar for 3 days with no food or water." Ezra's hands clenched into fists on the table. "Go on." "Yesterday morning he pulled me out and tied me up. Said he was tired of dealing with a worthless daughter who brought him nothing but shame. He loaded me in his wagon and drove out here to your fence." Lydia's voice broke. "He said maybe some lonely rancher would take me in exchange for doing chores and cooking. Like I was a piece of furniture he wanted to get rid of." The bacon grease had gone cold and white in the pan, but Ezra didn't notice. His mind was racing with anger and disbelief. "What's your father's name?" "Silas Brennan. He owns the grain store in Millfield, about 20 miles south of here. Everyone thinks he's a good Christian man because he goes to church every Sunday and gives money to the poor." Lydia laughed, but there was no humor in it. "They don't see what he's like behind closed doors." Ezra had heard of Millfield but never been there. It was one of those small towns that sprouted up around the railroad, full of people trying to make their fortune on the frontier. "Does he know where he left you?" "He knows. This is his land originally. He sold it to someone a few years back, but he still remembers every fence post and water hole. Lydia looked around the cabin nervously. He might come looking for me. Let him come, Ezra said grimly. I'd like to have a conversation with Mr. Silas Brennan about how a man should treat his daughter. No! Lydia grabbed his arm, her eyes wide with fear. You don't understand. He's not just mean, he's dangerous. He has friends, important people who owe him favors. If he wants me back, he'll find a way to get me, and he'll hurt anyone who gets in his way. Ezra looked down at her small hand on his arm, seeing the faded bruises around her wrist where the rope had been. Lydia, I've been living alone out here for 3 years. I faced down wolves, rustlers, and winter storms that could freeze a man solid. I'm not afraid of your father or his friends. You should be, Lydia whispered. He told me once that the only reason he kept me alive was because dead daughters ask too many questions from the law. But if I disappeared out here on the prairie, who would know? Who would care enough to look for me? The words hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Ezra realized that Lydia wasn't just afraid of her father. She was afraid that her life didn't matter to anyone, that she could vanish without a trace and the world would keep turning like nothing had happened. I would care, he said quietly, and I would look for you. For the first time since he found her, Lydia smiled. It was small and uncertain, but it was real. Why? Ezra thought about Martha, about the loneliness that had been his only companion for 3 long years, about the way this frightened young woman had already changed the feeling of his home just by sitting at his table. Because everyone deserves to matter to someone. The crash of thunder split the morning air like a gunshot, making both Ezra and Lydia jump from their chairs. Through the kitchen window, dark clouds rolled across the prairie like an army of shadows, bringing with them the promise of a fierce autumn storm. Lightning flickered in the distance, followed by another rumble that seemed to shake the very bones of the small cabin. Looks like we're in for some weather, Ezra said, trying to keep his voice calm despite the sudden tension in the air. He had lived through enough prairie storms to know this one would be a monster. The wind was already picking up, whistling through the gaps in the cabin walls and making the curtains dance. Lydia pressed her face to the window, watching the approaching storm with wide eyes. I've never seen clouds that black before, she whispered. They look angry. Prairie storms can be mean as rattlesnakes. Ezra agreed, moving to secure the shutters. But these walls are thick and the roof is solid. We'll be fine as long as we stay inside. As if the storm had heard him and wanted to prove him wrong, a gust of wind slammed into the cabin with enough force to rattle every dish on the shelves. The first drops of rain began to pelt the windows like thrown pebbles, growing heavier by the second. What about your cattle? Lydia asked, genuine concern in her voice. Won't they be scared? Ezra paused in his work, surprised by her question. Most people who didn't grow up on ranches never thought about the animals during storms. They'll find shelter in the low places, huddle together until it passes. Cattle are smarter than most folks give them credit for. The rain was coming down in sheets now, turning the world outside into a gray blur. Ezra lit the oil lamps to chase away the gloom that had settled over the cabin like a heavy blanket. In the warm yellow light, Lydia looked younger somehow, more vulnerable than she had that morning. Tell me about your wife, she said suddenly. If you don't mind talking about her. Ezra settled into his chair by the fireplace, surprised by the request. He rarely spoke about Martha, finding the memories too painful to share. But something about the storm outside and the quiet intimacy of the moment made him want to open that locked door in his heart. Martha was like sunshine, he began, his voice soft with remembrance. She could walk into a room and make everyone smile just by being there. Had a laugh that could cure a man's worst day, and a way of seeing the good in everything, even when times were hard. How did you meet her? Lydia asked, curling up in Martha's old rocking chair like a cat seeking warmth. At a church social in Yankton. I was 25 and convinced I'd be a bachelor forever. Too rough around the edges for any decent woman to want. Ezra smiled at the memory. But Martha saw something in me that I couldn't see in myself. She said I had kind eyes and gentle hands, even though I thought I was just another cowboy with dirt under his nails. Lightning lit up the cabin windows like daylight, followed immediately by a crack of thunder that made both of them flinch. The storm was directly overhead now, unleashing its full fury on the little cabin that suddenly felt very small and fragile. "Were you happy?" Lydia asked quietly. "Happier than I had any right to be," Ezra replied. "We had 5 good years together. Planned to fill this place with children, maybe expand the ranch, build something lasting." His voice caught slightly. "But the fever came that winter like a thief in the night. Took her so fast I barely had time to say goodbye." "I'm sorry," Lydia said, and meant it. "She sounds wonderful." She was. "And she would have liked you," Ezra said, surprising himself with the truth of it. "Martha always said the best people were the ones who had been through hard times but kept their hearts soft. She would have taken one look at you and decided you needed protecting." A strange sound cut through the storm's noise, the distant lowing of cattle in distress. Ezra's head snapped up, his rancher's instincts kicking in immediately. He moved to the window and peered out into the storm, trying to see through the wall of rain. "What is it?" Lydia asked, sensing his sudden tension. "Something's wrong with the herd," Ezra said, reaching for his rain slicker hanging by the door. "That's not their normal storm sound. They're scared of something more than weather. You can't go out in this," Lydia protested, jumping up from her chair. "You'll be struck by lightning or blown away." "Those cattle are my livelihood," Ezra said grimly, pulling on his boots. "If something happens to them, I lose everything. I have to check on them." But as he reached for the door handle, another sound cut through the storm, this one much closer and far more terrifying. The deep, rumbling growl of a mountain lion, somewhere near the cabin. Lydia went pale as snow. "Was that?" she began. "Cat," Ezra confirmed, his hand moving instinctively to the rifle hanging above the fireplace. "Big one by the sound of it. The storm must have driven it down from the hills looking for shelter." The growl came again, closer this time, followed by a scratching sound against the cabin's outer wall. Something large was moving around outside, and it wasn't friendly. Ezra checked his rifle, making sure it was loaded and ready. "What do we do?" Lydia whispered, her voice tight with fear. "We wait," Ezra said, though every instinct told him to go outside and face the threat head-on. Mountain lions don't usually attack humans unless they're cornered or starving. The storm will pass and it'll move on. But even as he spoke the words, Ezra wasn't sure he believed them. The scratching sound continued, methodical and persistent, as if the cat was testing the cabin's defenses. Outside, his cattle were still calling in distress, and he could hear them moving restlessly despite the storm. "Ezra," Lydia said, her voice barely audible above the wind and rain. "I think there's more than one." She was right. As they listened in tense silence, more sounds joined the first, multiple animals moving around the cabin, their low growls and heavy footsteps creating a symphony of menace that made Ezra's blood run cold. "Pack of them," he muttered, understanding the true danger they faced. Storms driven a whole family down from the mountains. The scratching at the walls grew more urgent, and somewhere in the distance, Ezra heard the unmistakable sound of his cattle breaking through fence wire in their panic to escape. Everything he had worked for was falling apart outside, but he couldn't leave Lydia alone to face whatever was circling their sanctuary. For the first time since Martha's death, Ezra felt truly afraid, not for himself, but for someone else who depended on him to keep them safe. The morning sun painted the cabin walls gold as Lydia woke to the sound of Ezra's axe splitting wood outside. The storm had passed in the night, leaving behind a world washed clean and sparkling with dew. She stretched in the small bed Ezra had made for her near the fireplace, feeling muscles she didn't know she had after yesterday's terror. The mountain lions had prowled around the cabin until nearly midnight before finally moving on to hunt easier prey. Ezra had stayed awake the whole time, rifle in hand, watching the windows and listening for any sign they might try to break in. Lydia had dozed fitfully in the rocking chair, starting awake every time the wind rattled a shutter or a branch scraped against the roof. Now, in the bright morning light, the danger seemed like a bad dream. But when Lydia looked out the window, she could see the deep claw marks gouged into the cabin's wooden siding, proof that the nightmare had been real. "Morning," Ezra called out as she stepped onto the porch, still wearing the spare clothes he had found for her, one of Martha's old dresses that hung loose on her smaller frame. "Sleep at all?" "Some," Lydia lied, not wanting to worry him. She could see the exhaustion in his face, the way his shoulders slumped from staying alert all night. "How bad is the damage?" Ezra leaned on his axe handle and surveyed his property with weary eyes. "Could be worse. Lost about 20 head of cattle. They broke through the north fence and scattered. Found tracks leading toward Miller's Creek, so they're probably holed up in the cottonwoods down there. Will you be able to get them back?" "Most of them, if I'm lucky. Cattle don't like to wander far from familiar ground." Ezra wiped sweat from his forehead with his sleeve. "Problem is, it'll take me the better part of 3 days to round them all up, and I can't leave you here alone. Not with those cats still in the area." Lydia felt a familiar knot form in her stomach. The feeling of being a burden, of causing problems for people who were trying to help her. "I could come with you," she offered. "I know how to ride, and I'm not afraid of hard work." Ezra looked at her with surprise. "It's rough country out there, Lydia. We'd be camping under the stars, eating cold beans, and riding hard from dawn to dusk. Not exactly proper for a young lady." "I haven't been a proper young lady for a long time," Lydia said with a bitter laugh. "And I'd rather take my chances with the wilderness than sit here worrying about mountain lions or my father showing up while you're gone." The mention of her father made Ezra's face harden. He had been trying not to think about Silas Brennan, but the man's threat hung over them like a storm cloud waiting to break. "You really think he'll come looking for you?" "I know he will. He doesn't like losing things that belong to him, even things he claims are worthless." Lydia picked up a piece of kindling and began breaking it into smaller pieces, needing something to do with her hands. "He'll wait a few days, let me get hungry and scared, then show up expecting me to be grateful for his mercy." "Well, he's going to be disappointed," Ezra said firmly. "You don't belong to anyone, Lydia. Not to him, not to me, not to anybody but yourself." The words hit Lydia like a physical blow, but not a painful one. For the first time in her life, someone was telling her she had value beyond what she could provide for others. She had to blink back tears to keep from crying in front of him. "So we go together," she said, trying to sound stronger than she felt. "Partners." Ezra studied her face, looking for signs of doubt or fear. What he saw instead was determination. The same steel backbone that had helped her survive her father's cruelty and a night tied to a fence post. "All right then, partner. But we do this my way. You follow my lead, stay close, and don't take any unnecessary risks." "Deal?" "Deal," Lydia agreed, extending her hand for him to shake. As their hands clasped, both of them felt something shift between them. A new understanding, a partnership born of necessity but growing into something deeper. They were no longer just rescuer and rescued. They were two people choosing to face whatever came next together. "We'll leave after breakfast," Ezra said, releasing her hand reluctantly. "I'll pack supplies while you gather anything you might need for 3 days on the trail." "I don't have anything to gather," Lydia said with a rueful smile. "Everything I own is on my back." "Then we'll stop in Millfield on the way back and get you some proper clothes and supplies," Ezra said without thinking, then paused as he realized what he had suggested. "If you want to, that is. Might be risky, going back to your father's town." "It's not his town," Lydia said, her voice gaining strength. "It's just a town where he happens to live. And yes, I'd like that. I'd like to walk down those streets with my head held high, knowing I chose to be there instead of being dragged there in shame." As they prepared for the journey ahead, neither of them noticed the lone rider watching from the ridge above the cabin. Silas Brennan sat his horse like a statue, his cold eyes taking in every detail of Ezra's ranch. He had tracked his daughter's scent like a bloodhound, and now he had found her playing house with some lonely cowboy who thought he could steal what belonged to another man. "Enjoy your little adventure," Daughter, Silas muttered under his breath, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. But you're coming home with me one way or another, and your new friend is going to learn what happens to men who interfere with family business. He turned his horse and rode away, disappearing into the morning shadows like a bad omen. Down in the cabin, Ezra was teaching Lydia how to load a rifle, showing her how to sight down the barrel and squeeze the trigger gently. Neither of them saw the danger that had already found them, or knew that their peaceful morning was about to become the calm before a much deadlier storm. Remember, Ezra was saying, his hand steady over hers as she held the weapon. A gun is just a tool. It's only as good or bad as the person using it. I understand, Lydia replied, feeling the weight of the rifle in her hands and the weight of responsibility that came with it. For the first time in her life, she was learning to protect herself instead of depending on others to do it for her. But protection, as they would soon discover, was about much more than knowing how to shoot. It was about knowing when to fight and when to run, when to trust and when to be suspicious, when to stand firm and when to bend like grass in the wind. The lessons they were about to learn would test everything they thought they knew about courage, loyalty, and the true meaning of family. The gunshot echoed across the valley like a church bell calling sinners to judgment. Ezra's horse reared up on its hind legs, nearly throwing him from the saddle as the bullet whistled past his ear and buried itself in the trunk of a nearby cottonwood tree. Behind him, Lydia's mare bolted sideways, but she held on tight, her knuckles white against the leather reins. "Get down!" Ezra shouted, diving from his horse and pulling Lydia with him behind a fallen log. They had been riding the creek bed for 2 hours, searching for his scattered cattle, when the attack came without warning from the rocky outcrop above them. Well, called a voice from the rocks, cold and mocking. "Looks like my little girl has been playing cowboy with the local ranchers." Lydia's face went white as fresh snow. "Papa," she whispered, the word coming out like a prayer for mercy that would never be answered. Silas Brennan stood up slowly from behind a boulder, his rifle pointed down at them with steady hands. He wasn't alone. 2 other men flanked him on either side, their faces hard as the stone they hid behind. One was tall and thin like a scarecrow, with mean little eyes and tobacco stains on his beard. The other was built like a bull, all muscle and anger, with hands that looked like they enjoyed breaking things. "You've caused me a lot of trouble, daughter," Silas continued, his voice carrying easily in the clear morning air. "Running off like a spoiled child, making me chase you across half the territory. But playtime's over now." Ezra kept his head low but slowly reached for his rifle, trying not to make any sudden movements that might provoke more shooting. "This is between you and me, Brennan," he called out. "Leave the girl out of it." "The girl belongs to me," Silas replied, his tone suggesting the matter wasn't open for discussion. "And you've been harboring stolen property. In some places, they hang men for less." "She's not property," Ezra shot back, anger making his voice louder than wisdom suggested. "She's a human being with the right to choose her own path." Silas laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "Rights? You think my worthless daughter has rights? She's caused me nothing but grief since the day she was born. The only right she has is to do what her father tells her." Lydia pressed herself against the log, trying to make herself as small as possible. But something was building inside her chest, not fear, but fury. The same rage that had made her run away in the first place was growing stronger with every cruel word her father spoke. "I'm not going back with you," she called out, her voice shaking but clear. "I'd rather die out here than spend another day in your house." "That can be arranged," said the bull-like man, his hand moving to the pistol on his hip. "Boss, why don't we just shoot the cowboy and take the girl? Save us all a lot of trouble." "Because I want her to understand the consequences of her choices," Silas replied. "Bruno, go down there and bring her up. If the rancher tries to stop you, kill him." Bruno started down the rocky slope, his boots sending small stones skittering ahead of him. Ezra gripped his rifle tighter, knowing he might only get one shot before the other 2 men opened fire. But one shot might be enough if he made it count. "Lydia," he whispered urgently, "when I start shooting, You run for those trees by the creek. Don't look back. Don't wait for me. Just run. I won't leave you, she whispered back fiercely. We're partners, remember? Ezra felt his heart swell with pride and terror in equal measure. This brave young woman was willing to stand and fight beside him, even against impossible odds. But he couldn't let her throw her life away for his sake. Sometimes being partners means trusting your partner to know what's best, he said softly. And right now, what's best is keeping you alive. Bruno was halfway down the slope now, grinning like a wolf that had cornered a rabbit. He was taking his time, enjoying the fear he thought he was causing. But he had made a mistake. He was too focused on his prey to watch his footing on the loose rocks. Ezra waited until the big man took another step, then stood up suddenly and fired. The bullet caught Bruno in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending him tumbling down the rocky face with a cry of pain and surprise. He hit the bottom hard and lay still, blood seeping through his shirt. The other two men immediately opened fire, their bullets chipping bark from the log and whining overhead like angry wasps. Ezra and Lydia pressed themselves flat against the ground as would splinters rain down on them. That was a mistake, rancher, Silas shouted, his voice tight with rage. Now you've made this personal. It was already personal the minute you tied your daughter to my fence. Ezra shouted back, reloading his rifle with practiced speed. From their position behind the log, they could hear the wounded man groaning and cursing. The other two had stopped shooting, probably to save ammunition or change position. In the sudden quiet, Lydia could hear her own heartbeat pounding like a drum in her ears. What now? She whispered. Now we make them think twice about coming down here, Ezra replied grimly. He had faced dangerous men before, but never three at once, and never with someone he cared about depending on him to keep them safe. A new voice called out from the rocks, the thin man with the tobacco-stained beard. Hey girl, you see what your boyfriend did to Bruno? That's on you. Every drop of blood spilled today is your fault for running away from your family. My family? Lydia's voice cracked with bitter laughter. You call this family? Shooting at people, threatening to kill anyone who shows me kindness? A real family protects each other. A real family obeys the father, Silas called down coldly. Something you never learned. But don't worry, daughter. I'll teach you proper respect once we get home. A few weeks in the cellar with nothing but bread and water might help you remember your place. The casual cruelty in his voice made Ezra's blood boil. He had seen enough bullies in his life to recognize the type men who used fear and violence to control others because they had nothing else to offer. But this was worse than a simple bully. This was a father threatening his own child. The only place she belongs is wherever she chooses to be, Ezra called out. And she's chosen to stay with me. Then you'll both die for that choice, Silas replied matter-of-factly. Jake, circle around to the left. I'll take the right. We'll pin them down and finish this. As the two men began moving to new positions, Ezra realized their situation was about to get much worse. The log that protected them from the front would be useless once their attackers could shoot from the sides. They needed to move and fast. Can you swim? He asked Lydia urgently. Yes, but the creek's about 30 feet behind us. When I say go, we run for the water and let the current carry us downstream. It's our only chance. Lydia nodded, fear and determination warring in her eyes. She had never been in a gunfight before, but she understood survival. And right now, survival meant trusting Ezra completely. Ready? He asked. Ready? She replied, though her voice shook with the lie. The icy creek water hit them like a slap from winter itself, stealing their breath and numbing their hands in seconds. Ezra grabbed Lydia's arm as the current caught them, pulling them downstream faster than either had expected. Behind them, angry shouts and rifle shots echoed off the water, but the bullets fell harmlessly into the creek bed they had already passed. Keep your head down, Ezra gasped, fighting to keep both of them afloat as they swept around a bend that put rocks and trees between them and their pursuers. The water was deeper here, flowing swift and dark between banks lined with willows whose trailing branches created a green tunnel overhead. Lydia's teeth were already chattering, but she managed to nod and grab onto a piece of driftwood that floated past. The current was doing most of the work now, carrying them away from immediate danger while Silas and his remaining man tried to figure out where they had gone. "How far does this creek run?" she managed to ask between shivers. "About 2 miles before it joins up with the North Fork," Ezra replied, scanning the banks for a safe place to climb out. "We need to get out of this water soon or we'll freeze to death before your father gets another chance to shoot us." They floated in relative silence for several minutes, listening for sounds of pursuit but hearing only the gurgle of water over stones and the rustle of wind through the cottonwoods. Finally, Ezra spotted what he was looking for. A fallen tree that formed a natural bridge across the creek, with thick brush on both sides that would hide them while they caught their breath. "There," he said, pointing to the makeshift shelter. "We can rest and dry out." Getting out of the water proved harder than getting in. The creek banks were slippery with mud and fallen leaves, and their numb fingers couldn't grip the roots and rocks properly. But after several failed attempts, they managed to pull themselves up into the tangle of branches beneath the fallen tree. Lydia immediately began stripping off her wet outer clothes, practical necessity overriding modesty. Her lips were blue and her whole body shook with cold. Ezra did the same, wringing out his shirt and pants before hanging them on branches to dry. "We can't stay here long," he said, his own voice unsteady from the chill. "Your father will backtrack along the creek bank looking for where we came out." "Let him look," Lydia said with surprising venom. "I hope he falls in and drowns." The hatred in her voice shocked them both. Lydia had been raised to honor her father despite his cruelty, but something fundamental had broken inside her when she heard him order her death as casually as asking for a cup of coffee. "I'm sorry," she said quickly, seeing Ezra's expression. "I shouldn't talk about my own father that way." "Your father just tried to kill you," Ezra replied gently. "And me. I think that breaks whatever obligations you might have had to honor him." They sat in silence for a while, shivering and listening to their clothes drip. The fallen tree created a small shelter, but it wasn't warm, and they both knew they couldn't stay hidden forever. Eventually, they would have to move, and when they did, they would be on foot in dangerous country with armed men hunting them. "Ezra," Lydia said quietly, "what you did back there, shooting that man to protect me, no one's ever done anything like that for me before." "Any decent person would have done the same," Ezra replied, but his words carried the weight of deep emotion. "No, they wouldn't have. Most people would have handed me over to avoid trouble." Lydia looked at him with eyes that seemed older than they had that morning. "Why are you risking everything for someone you barely know?" Ezra was quiet for a long moment, considering his answer. "Maybe because I know what it's like to lose everything that matters. When Martha died, I thought my life was over. I figured I'd just work my ranch until I got too old, then die alone and forgotten." He met her gaze. "But finding you tied to that fence, it reminded me that there are still things worth fighting for in this world." "Like what?" "Like the idea that good people shouldn't have to suffer just because cruel people have power over them. Like the belief that everyone deserves a chance to choose their own happiness." Ezra's voice grew stronger. "Like you, Lydia. You're worth fighting for, even if you don't see it yet." Tears mixed with creek water on Lydia's cheeks. "I do see it now. For the first time in my life, I understand that I have value beyond what I can do for other people." A distant sound made them both freeze. The crack of a branch breaking under someone's weight. Someone was moving through the woods nearby, and they were trying to be quiet about it. Ezra reached for his rifle, then remembered it was probably at the bottom of the creek where he had dropped it when they jumped in. All he had left was his knife and his wits, neither of which seemed adequate against armed men. The footsteps came closer, slow and careful. Through the screen of branches, they could see a figure moving among the trees, the thin man with the tobacco-stained beard, his rifle ready as he searched for signs of their passage. Lydia pressed herself against Ezra, trying to become invisible. But the man was methodical, checking every hiding spot, every shadow that might conceal two desperate fugitives. It was only a matter of time before he found their shelter. "When he gets close enough," Ezra whispered in her ear, "I'm going to rush him. You run the opposite direction and don't stop until you reach the road." "No," Lydia whispered back fiercely. We stay together. Lydia. Together? She repeated. And there was steel in her voice that reminded Ezra of Martha's stubborn courage. The searcher was only 20 feet away now, close enough that they could hear him muttering under his breath about tracking runaways through swampland. His rifle swung back and forth as he probed the underbrush, and his finger rested on the trigger. Suddenly, a new sound split the air, the thunder of hoofbeats approaching fast along the creek bank. The thin man spun around, raising his rifle toward the noise, confusion clear on his weathered face. "Jake!" came a voice from the approaching riders. "Jake, where are you?" But it wasn't Silas Brennan's voice. It was deeper, more authoritative, and it carried the unmistakable tone of lawful authority. Through the trees, Ezra and Lydia could see a group of mounted men wearing badges that glinted in the filtered sunlight. The thin man, Jake, immediately lowered his rifle and tried to look innocent, but his nervous movements gave him away. When the lawmen surrounded him, he was stammering explanations that didn't make much sense. "We had reports of gunfire in this area," said the lead rider, a grizzled man with a sheriff's star pinned to his vest. "You wouldn't know anything about that, would you?" "Just hunting, Sheriff," Jake replied quickly. "Thought I saw a deer, but it got away." "Funny thing about that," the sheriff said conversationally. "We also had a report from a homesteader upstream. Said he saw 3 men with rifles taking shots at a man and woman by the creek. You matched the description pretty well." Jake's face went pale, and his eyes darted around looking for an escape route. But he was surrounded, and the lawmen's hands rested casually on their weapons. "Now," the sheriff continued, "I'm going to ask you one more time, and I suggest you think real careful about your answer. Where are Silas Brennan and his other man, and what did you do with the folks you were shooting at?" From their hiding place, Ezra and Lydia exchanged glances of hope and disbelief. Help had arrived in the form of the territorial law, but they weren't safe yet. They still had to reveal themselves without getting shot, and there was still the question of where Silas had gone. As if summoned by their thoughts, another gunshot rang out from somewhere upstream, followed by a scream that made Lydia's blood run cold. The scream pierced the forest silence like a knife through cloth, high and desperate and unmistakably human. Sheriff Coleman's head snapped toward the sound, his weathered face hardening into the expression of a man who had heard too many cries for help in his 20 years of keeping the peace in Dakota Territory. "That came from the old mining camp," he said grimly, spurring his horse toward the source of the distress. "Johnson, Miller, you stay here and watch this one. The rest of you with me." From their hiding place beneath the fallen tree, Ezra and Lydia watched the lawmen thunder upstream, leaving only 2 deputies to guard the captured Jake. This was their chance to reveal themselves, but something about that scream held them frozen in place. It had sounded like a woman, but not like Lydia. Someone else was in trouble. "We have to help," Lydia whispered, starting to crawl out from their shelter. "Wait," Ezra caught her arm. "That could be a trap. Your father's clever enough to use someone else's pain to draw us out." But even as he spoke, another scream echoed through the trees, weaker this time, fading like a dying echo. Someone was hurt badly, and every second they hesitated might mean the difference between life and death for another innocent person. "I can't hide while someone suffers," Lydia said firmly, pulling free from his grip. "Not anymore. I've spent too many years watching cruelty happen and doing nothing to stop it." Before Ezra could protest further, she stood up and walked out into the open, her hands raised to show she meant no harm to the remaining deputies. "Don't shoot," she called out. "We're the people you're looking for." The 2 lawmen spun around, their hands moving to their weapons before they saw that she was unarmed and clearly not a threat. Ezra emerged from the brush behind her, muddy and bedraggled but alive. "Ma'am," said Deputy Johnson, a young man who looked barely old enough to wear a badge. "Are you hurt?" "We're fine," Lydia replied quickly. "But someone else isn't." "That scream. Do you know who it was?" "Could be anyone," Deputy Miller answered, his eyes scanning the woods for additional threats. "This whole area's been crawling with trouble lately. Claim jumpers, cattle rustlers, men running from the law. Jake, still under guard, suddenly spoke up. It's probably just old Sarah Lightfoot, crazy Indian woman who lives up at the abandoned mine, always making noise about spirits and such. Sarah Lightfoot? Ezra repeated, the name stirring a memory. I thought she died years ago. Nah, she's still kicking. Leastways, she was yesterday when we… Jake stopped talking abruptly, realizing he had said too much. When you what? Deputy Miller demanded, stepping closer to the prisoner. Jake's face went pale again. Nothing. I didn't say nothing. But Lydia had caught the slip, and pieces of a larger puzzle were starting to fall into place in her mind. You hurt her, she said, not asking but stating a fact. My father and his men hurt that woman, and now she's dying alone up there. You don't know what you're talking about, Jake protested, but his nervous shifting gave him away. Another scream drifted down from the mining camp, weaker still but filled with such agony that it made everyone present wince. Without waiting for permission from the deputies, Lydia started walking upstream toward the sound. Ma'am, you can't just… Deputy Johnson began. Try and stop me, Lydia replied without breaking stride. There was something different about her now, a strength that hadn't been there before. The frightened girl who had been tied to a fence was gone, replaced by a woman who had discovered her own power to choose right from wrong. Ezra fell into step beside her, and after a moment's hesitation, the deputies followed with their prisoner. They moved quickly through the trees, guided by the occasional weak cry that told them they were heading in the right direction. The abandoned mine sat in a clearing scarred by years of digging and blasting. Wooden structures that had once housed equipment now stood like broken teeth against the sky. And there, tied to a post in front of the main shaft, was an elderly Native American woman. Sarah Lightfoot was perhaps 60 years old, with long gray hair and skin weathered by decades of prairie sun and wind. Her clothes were torn, and dark stains on the ground beneath her suggested she had been beaten badly. Her eyes were closed, and she hung limply against her bonds as if unconsciousness was the only escape from her pain. Dear God, Deputy Miller breathed, rushing forward to cut her free. Lydia knelt beside the woman as soon as the ropes fell away, checking for signs of life. Sarah's breathing was shallow but steady, and her pulse fluttered under Lydia's fingers like a trapped bird. Why? Lydia demanded, spinning to face Jake with fury blazing in her eyes. Why would you hurt a helpless old woman? She wasn't supposed to be there, Jake mumbled, unable to meet her gaze. We was just using the mine to store some merchandise. She came poking around, threatening to tell the sheriff about our business. What kind of merchandise? Deputy Johnson asked sharply. Jake's mouth clamped shut, but his silence was answer enough. The abandoned mine was being used as a hideout for stolen goods, probably cattle rustled from ranches throughout the territory. Sarah Lightfoot had stumbled onto their operation and paid the price for her discovery. She needs a doctor, Lydia said, cradling the unconscious woman's head in her lap. She's hurt bad inside. I can see it in her breathing. Nearest doctor's in Millfield, Deputy Miller replied. That's a hard 2-hour ride from here. Then we better get started, Ezra said, already moving to fashion a stretcher from fallen branches and his own shirt. She won't last long without proper care. As they worked to prepare Sarah for transport, Lydia found herself thinking about the connections between all the violence that had erupted in these peaceful woods. Her father's cruelty, the cattle rustling, the attack on an innocent woman. It all seemed tied together by threads of greed and power that stretched back farther than she had imagined. Jake, she said suddenly, a terrible suspicion forming in her mind. How long has my father been involved in your cattle stealing? I don't know what you mean, Jake replied, but his eyes flickered with guilt. Yes, you do. This wasn't just about dragging me home, was it? He's part of your gang, isn't he? That's why he was so confident about having the law on his side, because he's been paying off the right people to look the other way. The silence that followed her accusation was louder than any confession. Even the deputies exchanged meaningful glances, pieces of their own puzzle falling into place. Silas Brennan's grain store would be the perfect front for moving stolen cattle through the territory, and his reputation as a respectable businessman would deflect suspicion. "Ma'am," Deputy Johnson said carefully, "if what you're suggesting is true, this case just got a lot more complicated. And a lot more dangerous," Ezra added grimly. "If Brennan's been operating a rustling ring right under the sheriff's nose, he's got resources we haven't even thought about yet." As if summoned by their words, the sound of approaching horses echoed through the clearing. But these weren't the sheriff's men returning. The hoofbeats were coming from the wrong direction, and they carried the urgency of pursuit rather than rescue. "He's found us?" Lydia whispered, her newfound courage wavering as the reality of their situation hit home. They were trapped in an open clearing with an unconscious woman, facing down a man who had already tried to kill them once and now had even more reason to make sure they never told their story to the law. The hoofbeats grew louder, closer, more numerous than Lydia had expected. Whatever was coming toward them through the trees, it was bigger than just her father and his remaining hired gun. The riders burst into the clearing like thunder rolling across the sky, but it wasn't Silas Brennan leading the charge. Sheriff Coleman sat tall in his saddle at the head of 6 mounted men, his badge glinting in the afternoon sun as his eyes took in the scene before him, the injured woman, the makeshift stretcher, and the guilty expression on Jake's face that told a story without words. "Well now," the sheriff said in his gravelly voice, dismounting with the careful movements of a man who had spent more years in the saddle than he cared to count. "Looks like we've got ourselves a situation here." Behind him, his deputies spread out in a semicircle, their hands resting easy on their weapons but ready to draw at the first sign of trouble. These were experienced lawmen who had seen enough frontier justice to know when they were walking into something bigger than a simple family dispute. "Sheriff," Deputy Johnson called out, relief evident in his voice. "We've got casualties here. This woman needs medical attention fast, and our prisoner's been talking about cattle rustling operations." "Has he now?" Sheriff Coleman's weathered face showed no surprise, but his eyes hardened as they fixed on Jake. "Funny thing about that, we just found Silas Brennan about a mile upstream, shot through the leg and madder than a wet hornet. Claims he was attacked by claim jumpers while hunting for his runaway daughter." Lydia stepped forward, her chin raised despite the tremor in her hands. "He's lying, Sheriff. My father wasn't hunting for me. He was trying to kill me and Mr. Whitlock here for refusing to hand me over like a piece of property." "That's a serious accusation, miss," the sheriff replied, his tone neutral but his eyes studying her face with the intensity of a man who made his living reading people. "You got any proof to back up words like that?" "The bullet holes in the trees by Miller's Creek," Ezra said grimly. "The witness who reported hearing gunshots. And the fact that this man here," he pointed at Jake, "was hunting us with a rifle when your deputies found him." Sheriff Coleman nodded slowly, then walked over to where Sarah Lightfoot lay unconscious on the makeshift stretcher. He knelt beside her, his expression growing darker as he took in the extent of her injuries. "Sarah's been living peaceful in these hills for near on 15 years, he said quietly. "Never hurt nobody, never caused trouble. She's got a right to walk these woods without fear." He stood up, his hand resting on his gun butt. "Jake Dawson, you're under arrest for assault and battery. And if this good woman dies from her injuries, you'll be facing a murder charge." "Now hold on, Sheriff," Jake protested, panic creeping into his voice. "I was just following orders." Brennan said the old squaw was interfering with legitimate business operations. "What kind of business operations?" Sheriff Coleman asked, his voice deceptively calm. Jake's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water as he realized he had walked straight into a trap. Lydia watched with fascination as the sheriff played the man like a master fisherman, giving him just enough line to hang himself. "Cattle business," Jake finally mumbled. "Moving livestock through the territory for various clients. Clients who don't happen to own the cattle they're moving, I guess," the sheriff said dryly. "Deputy Miller, check the mine shaft. I suspect we're going to find some interesting evidence of Mr. Brennan's legitimate business operations." While the deputy disappeared into the dark mouth of the mine, Sheriff Coleman turned his attention to Lydia and Ezra, His expression softened slightly as he took in their bedraggled appearance and the obvious care they were showing for the injured woman. "Miss Brennan, I need to hear your side of the story from the beginning. And I need the whole truth, not some watered-down version that protects people who don't deserve protecting." Lydia took a deep breath and began to talk. She told him about being tied to the fence, about Ezra's kindness, about her father's threats and the gunfight by the creek. She spoke about the pattern of cruelty that had marked her entire life, the way her father used fear and violence to control everyone around him. As she talked, Deputy Miller emerged from the mine shaft carrying a canvas bag that clinked with the sound of metal on metal. "Sheriff, you need to see this. Bag full of cattle brands. Looks like they've been changing ownership marks on stolen livestock." Well, Sheriff Coleman said, examining the contents of the bag. "Looks like we've got ourselves a full-blown rustling operation. Jake, I think you better start talking about who else is involved in this business, because right now you're looking at 20 years in territorial prison." But before Jake could answer, the sound of a single horse approaching at full gallop made everyone in the clearing tense up. Through the trees came Silas Brennan, his face twisted with rage and pain, his left leg bound with a crude bandage that was already seeping blood. "Sheriff," he called out as he rode into the clearing. "Thank God you found them. That man there," he pointed at Ezra with a shaking finger, "kidnapped my daughter and tried to murder me when I came to bring her home." "Is that so?" Sheriff Coleman replied mildly. "Funny thing, Mr. Brennan, your daughter here tells a very different story. Says you tied her to a fence post and left her for dead, then tried to shoot her when she wouldn't come back to your tender, loving care." Silas's eyes darted around the clearing, taking in the injured Sarah Lightfoot, the bag of stolen cattle brands, and Jake's guilty expression. Lydia could see him calculating, trying to figure out how much the lawman knew and how much he could still lie his way out of. "Whatever she told you, Sheriff, you can't believe it," Silas said, forcing his voice to sound reasonable and concerned. "She's been acting strange lately, telling wild stories, running off with strange men. I think she might be having some kind of mental breakdown." "Mental breakdown?" Lydia's voice cracked like a whip across the clearing. "Is that what you call it when a daughter refuses to let her father sell her to the highest bidder? When she won't quietly accept being beaten and starved and treated like livestock? Now, daughter, you know that's not. Don't you dare call me daughter." Lydia stepped forward, her eyes blazing with years of suppressed anger. "A real father protects his children, loves them, helps them grow into the people they're meant to be. You've done nothing but try to break my spirit since the day I was born." The clearing fell silent except for the sound of Sarah Lightfoot's labored breathing and the nervous shifting of horses. Sheriff Coleman watched the confrontation with the keen interest of a man who was seeing family secrets spill out into the light of day. "Mr. Brennan," the sheriff said finally, "I think you better dismount and let Deputy Johnson take a look at that leg wound. Then we're all going to ride back to town and sort this mess out proper-like." "I'm not going anywhere with these criminals," Silas snarled. "I demand you arrest that man for kidnapping and assault. The only person getting arrested right now is Jake Dawson for cattle rustling and assault on Sarah Lightfoot," Sheriff Coleman replied firmly. "As for the rest, we'll let a judge decide who's telling the truth and who's spinning tales." But Silas Brennan had not built his criminal empire by giving up easily. His hand dropped to his gun, and for a moment the clearing balanced on the knife's edge between law and chaos. "I wouldn't do that if I were you," the sheriff said quietly, his own weapon appearing in his hand with practiced speed. "You're outgunned and outmanned, and that leg wounds made you slower than usual." The standoff stretched for long seconds while everyone held their breath. Then, slowly, Silas raised his hands in surrender, his face twisted with defeat and rage. But Lydia knew her father too well to believe he was truly beaten. Even as the deputies moved to disarm him, she could see the calculation in his eyes, the way he was already planning his next move. The game was far from over. The jail cell door slammed shut with a sound like thunder, but it wasn't Silas Brennan behind the iron bars. 3 hours after the confrontation at the mine, Lydia sat in the Millfield courthouse holding cell, her hands folded in her lap as she stared at the stone walls that seemed to close in tighter with each passing minute. "This is all wrong," Ezra said for the 10th time, pacing back and forth in front of Sheriff Coleman's desk like a caged wolf. "She's the victim here, not the criminal. How can you arrest her for her father's crimes?" Sheriff Coleman leaned back in his wooden chair, his weathered face showing the strain of a man trying to navigate between justice and politics. "I didn't have a choice, Whitlock. Judge Morrison got a telegram from the territorial governor himself. Seems Silas Brennan has friends in high places, friends who don't take kindly to accusations against upstanding businessmen." "Upstanding?" Ezra's voice cracked with disbelief. "The man tried to murder his own daughter. We found a bag full of stolen cattle brands in his operation. We found brands that Jake Dawson claims he stole on his own," the sheriff corrected grimly. "Soon as we got back to town, Brennan's lawyer showed up with papers proving his client's been in Yankton on business for the past week. Says he only came back today when he heard his mentally unstable daughter had run off with a stranger." Ezra stopped pacing and stared at the lawman. "You don't believe that garbage, do you?" "What I believe doesn't matter much when the territorial judge has already signed a warrant," Sheriff Coleman replied. "Miss Brennan's been declared mentally incompetent by a doctor who examined her father's sworn statement. She's to be held for evaluation until a proper medical assessment can be arranged." The words hit Ezra like physical blows. In less than 3 hours, Silas Brennan had somehow turned the entire situation upside down, transforming himself from criminal to concerned father and Lydia from victim to dangerous lunatic. The man's connections reached farther than anyone had imagined. "How long?" Ezra asked quietly. "Could be weeks, maybe months. The doctor who has to do the evaluation is currently in Denver treating patients. Won't be back until winter's over." From her cell, Lydia could hear every word of their conversation. She had been silent since they brought her in, overwhelmed by the speed with which her newfound freedom had been ripped away. But now, as the full scope of her father's power became clear, something hardened inside her chest like iron cooling in winter air. "Sheriff Coleman," she called out, her voice steady despite the fear gnawing at her heart. "May I speak with you privately?" The sheriff exchanged glances with Ezra, then walked over to the cell. "What's on your mind, miss?" "My father didn't just appear in town with a lawyer by accident," Lydia said quietly. "He's been planning this ever since I ran away, maybe even before that. The question is, what else has he been planning?" "What do you mean?" Lydia gripped the bars with white knuckles. "Sarah Lightfoot wasn't hurt because she stumbled onto a cattle rustling operation. She was hurt because she knows something about my father that he can't afford to have revealed. Something worth killing for." Sheriff Coleman's eyes sharpened with interest. "Go on." 3 years ago, a family named Henderson disappeared from their homestead about 10 miles north of here. Everyone assumed they just moved on. But Sarah told me once that she saw strange lights and heard gunshots from that direction one night. She was afraid to report it because people don't usually believe what Indian women have to say. The sheriff was quiet for a long moment, pieces of a larger puzzle shifting in his mind. "You think your father was involved in the Henderson disappearance?" "I think my father has been involved in a lot of things that people in this town would rather not know about," Lydia replied. "And I think Sarah Lightfoot was getting too close to the truth." Before the sheriff could respond, the courthouse door burst open and a man in an expensive suit strode in like he owned the building. Behind him came Silas Brennan, walking with a cane but looking remarkably recovered for someone who had supposedly been shot a few hours earlier. "Sheriff Coleman," the suit said in a voice accustomed to being obeyed. "I'm attorney Marcus Webb, representing Mr. Brennan in this unfortunate matter. I trust my client's daughter is being properly cared for during her medical evaluation." "She's fine," the sheriff replied curtly. "Though I have to say, Mr. Webb, this whole situation seems mighty convenient for your client. Mental illness often appears convenient to those who don't understand its complexities," Webb replied smoothly. "Mr. Brennan has been dealing with his daughter's increasingly erratic behavior for months, running away, making wild accusations against respected citizens, consorting with dangerous men. All classic symptoms of female hysteria." Ezra stepped forward, his hands clenched into fists. "The only dangerous man here is standing right behind you. Mr. Whitlock," isn't it? Webb turned his cold gaze on Ezra. I understand you've been harboring a mentally ill young woman against her family's wishes. In some jurisdictions, that would be considered kidnapping. Now hold on, Sheriff Coleman interjected. Nobody's been charged with kidnapping here. Not yet, Webb agreed pleasantly. But the Territorial Attorney General takes a dim view of men who take advantage of vulnerable women. I'm sure he'd be very interested in hearing how Mr. Whitlock here has been keeping Miss Brennan isolated from her family and proper medical care. The threat hung in the air like smoke from a poisonous fire. Ezra realized with growing horror that he was watching a masterfully orchestrated legal trap snap shut around both him and Lydia. Silas Brennan had spent years building relationships with powerful people, and now he was calling in every favor to destroy anyone who threatened his carefully constructed empire. Papa, Lydia said quietly, her voice carrying clearly through the courthouse. You can lock me up, have me declared insane, even have me killed. But you can't change what I know about you. Silas approached her cell with the careful steps of a predator stalking wounded prey. And what exactly do you think you know, daughter? I know about the Hendersons. I know about the cattle rustling. I know about the bribes you've been paying to keep certain lawmen looking the other way. Lydia's voice grew stronger with each word. But most of all, I know about Martha Whitlock. The courthouse fell silent as if everyone had suddenly forgotten how to breathe. Ezra's face went white as snow, and Sheriff Coleman's hand moved instinctively toward his weapon. What about Martha Whitlock? Ezra asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Lydia looked at him with eyes full of pain and compassion. She didn't die of fever, Ezra. She was poisoned. And my father was the one who supplied the poison. The revelation hit the room like a physical blow. Silas Brennan's face twisted with rage, but before he could speak, his lawyer grabbed his arm in warning. My client has no idea what this disturbed young woman is talking about, Webb said quickly. These are obviously the delusions of someone suffering from severe mental illness. But Lydia wasn't finished. Martha found out about the cattle rustling operation. She was going to report it to the territorial marshal. So my father made sure she never got the chance. He told Dr. Patterson it was medicine for her stomach troubles, but it was really mercury poison, given slowly over weeks to make it look like a natural illness. Ezra staggered backward as if he'd been shot, his world tilting on its axis. For 3 years, he had mourned his wife's death from fever, never suspecting that she had been murdered by the man whose daughter he had saved. You're lying, he breathed. But even as he said the words, pieces of memory were falling into place. Martha's sudden illness, the strange symptoms that didn't quite match any fever he'd ever seen, the way she had whispered about important information that she needed to tell someone before she died. I'm not lying, Lydia said gently. I overheard him bragging about it to Jake Dawson. He said it was the perfect crime because nobody suspects a grieving widower of being involved in his own wife's death. In the terrible silence that followed, everyone in the courthouse understood that they had moved far beyond simple family disputes or cattle rustling. They were now dealing with murder, corruption, and a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of territorial government. And somewhere in the growing darkness outside, Sarah Lightfoot lay fighting for her life, the only other witness to crimes that powerful men would kill to keep hidden. The candle flame danced shadows across the walls of Doc Patterson's clinic as Sarah Lightfoot's eyes fluttered open for the first time in 2 days. Her weathered face was pale as moonlight, but her dark eyes held the sharp intelligence that had kept her alive through 60 years of frontier hardships. Easy now, Doc Patterson murmured, checking her pulse with gentle fingers. You've been through quite an ordeal, Sarah. Just rest and let your body heal. But Sarah's gaze wasn't focused on the doctor. She was staring at Lydia, who sat in a chair beside the bed despite being technically under arrest. Sheriff Coleman had allowed the visit after Sarah's condition had improved enough for her to speak, hoping the old woman might provide crucial testimony about the events at the mine. You, Sarah whispered, her voice like wind through dry grass. You're Silas Brennan's girl. Yes, Lydia replied softly. I'm sorry for what they did to you. Sorry my father's men hurt you because of his greed. Sarah studied her for a long moment, then slowly shook her head. Not greed, fear. Your father is afraid of what I know, what I saw 3 winters past. Sheriff Coleman leaned forward from his position by the door. What did you see, Sarah? The night Martha Whitlock died, Sarah said, her words carefully chosen despite her weakness. I was gathering healing herbs by moonlight when I saw a rider approach the Whitlock cabin. Recognized the horse, big bay mare with white stockings that Silas Brennan always rode. Ezra, who had been standing silent in the corner, suddenly gripped the back of Lydia's chair so hard his knuckles went white. You saw him at my cabin the night Martha died? Saw him go in, saw him come out maybe an hour later. But that wasn't the strange part. Sarah's eyes never left Lydia's face. Strange part was seeing him again 2 days later, digging a hole behind his grain store in the middle of the night. What was he burying? Sheriff Coleman asked, though his tone suggested he already suspected the answer. Bottle, Sarah replied simply. Small brown bottle like the kind Doc Patterson uses for his strongest medicines. Threw it in the hole and covered it up real careful-like. The clinic fell silent except for the soft hiss of the oil lamp and Sarah's labored breathing. Everyone in the room understood the significance of what she had just revealed, physical evidence of Silas Brennan's involvement in Martha Whitlock's death. Sarah, Lydia said gently, why didn't you tell anyone what you saw? The old woman's laugh was bitter as winter wind. Tell who? The sheriff who takes money from your father to look the other way. The judge who owes his position to your father's political connections. The doctor who supplied the poison in the first place. Dr. Patterson's face went ashen. Now see here, I never. You gave Silas Brennan mercury compounds, Sarah continued relentlessly. Told him it was for treating his horse's worms, but there wasn't nothing wrong with his horses. And you gave him enough to kill a dozen people, not just one sick woman. The doctor's hands began to shake as the weight of his unwitting complicity settled on his shoulders. He said, he told me it was for veterinary use. I had no idea. Course you didn't, Sarah said with gentle sadness. Good people never suspect evil until it's too late to stop it. Sheriff Coleman stepped forward, his face grim with determination. Sarah, would you be willing to testify to all this in court? Knowing that some very powerful people aren't going to want your story heard. I'm an old woman, Sarah replied. Been living on borrowed time since the cavalry burned my village 40 years ago. If telling the truth about what I saw can bring justice for Martha Whitlock and keep that girl there from suffering her mother's fate, then yes, I'll testify. Her mother's fate? Ezra looked up sharply. What do you mean? Sarah's eyes moved between Lydia and her father's picture on the wanted poster Sheriff Coleman had tacked to the wall. You think Lydia's the first daughter Silas Brennan tried to get rid of? Her mother asked too many questions about his business dealings, started making noise about going to the territorial authorities. One day she just disappeared, and Silas told everyone she'd run off with a traveling preacher. Lydia's breath caught in her throat. My mother didn't abandon me? Your mother loved you more than life itself, Sarah said firmly. But she loved justice more than she feared your father's anger. And it cost her everything. The revelations were coming too fast for anyone to fully process. In the span of an hour, they had gone from a simple case of family dispute to uncovering a pattern of murder and corruption that stretched back years. Silas Brennan wasn't just a cattle rustler. He was a serial killer who eliminated anyone who threatened his carefully constructed criminal empire. We need to get to that bottle, Sheriff Coleman said grimly. If it's still buried behind the grain store, it might contain enough residue to prove what Sarah's telling us. He'll have moved it by now, Lydia said quietly. Or destroyed it. My father's too smart to leave evidence lying around when he knows people are asking questions. Maybe, the sheriff agreed. But men like your father get overconfident. They start thinking they're untouchable, that their money and connections can buy them out of any trouble. Sometimes that arrogance is what brings them down. Outside the clinic window, the first pale light of dawn was beginning to touch the eastern horizon. Somewhere in town, Silas Brennan was probably sleeping peacefully in his comfortable bed, confident that his wealth and political connections had once again saved him from the consequences of his actions. But he had made one crucial mistake in his calculations. He had underestimated the courage of the women he had tried to silence, his own daughter, who had found the strength to speak truth to power, and an elderly Native American woman whose loyalty to justice was stronger than her fear of retribution. "What happens now?" Lydia asked, looking around at the faces of the people who had become her unlikely allies in the fight against her father's tyranny. "Now we build a case that even corrupt judges and bought politicians can't ignore," Sheriff Coleman replied. "We gather evidence, find witnesses, and make sure the truth comes out no matter who tries to stop it." "And if they try to stop us?" Ezra asked quietly. The sheriff's hand rested on his gun, but as he considered the question, "Then we remind them that justice isn't just an idea. It's a promise. And some promises are worth fighting for, no matter what the cost." As the sun rose over Millfield, casting long shadows across the dusty streets, the battle lines were finally drawn. On one side stood wealth, corruption, and the power of those who believed they were above the law. On the other stood truth, courage, and the unshakable belief that right would ultimately triumph over might. The final confrontation was coming, and everyone involved knew that only one side would be left standing when the dust settled.